Welcome. Welcome to all of you. My name is Penny Wright. Many of you are familiar patrons, and some of you are new faces to us, and we're delighted to have each of you here. I want to mention that, of course, for those of you who live in our library district, you already get our newsletters, July, August. For those of you who do not live in our school district, which is our library district, if you join our Friends of the Library, for whatever amount you choose to give, you will get all of our newsletters in the mail every 3 months. So we love it when people do that. I just want to make two short announcements, and then we'll go ahead and get started. One is, related to water. Tomorrow we have a woman who's written just a terrific book, Lori Gwen Shapiro. She's a documentary filmmaker and a writer. And she wrote a book that got a great review in the Times a few months ago, so we invited her here. She's coming at noon. We have lots of people coming. But it's a story, it's a true story, of a young, I think it was 16-year-old New York City kid who stowed away on a boat captained by Admiral Byrd headed for Antarctica. And it's a terrific book. She's coming around. And the other thing I'm going to mention is a talk we're having in about a week and a half, and I'm mentioning this because we do not have many people interested in coming so far, but it's a subject that is important, and you may feel that you've had enough of sexual harassment in the workplace, but this woman is a really exceptionally good speaker. She wrote a book. She lives here. I want people to come. She wrote a book 3 years ago called Opening Bell, B-E-L-L-E. It was a very well-written novel, and it was a thinly veiled, disguised accounting of her years as the managing director at Bear Stearns and what it was like to be a woman there. Her book is very engaging. She got a lot of national press. She was on PBS NewsHour. Reese Witherspoon asked her to write a screenplay. Reese Witherspoon is starring in the movie that's coming out, and we do hope you'll come to this. And she's actually a fantastic speaker.
Eddie, what's your name?
Her name is Maureen Sherry, and the title of her talk is Women and Workplace Harassment, a Turning Point, ? Now, we figured this out a year ago, so we thought we were ahead of the ball, but of course now it's a subject that some people probably consider is a tired subject, but please come. We'll be very happy if you come. Anyway, I know you're here tonight for a reason. We would all like to see our locale thrive in the face of climate change, and here tonight is someone who's spent his entire professional career working on issues that are important in that regard. His name is Kevin McAllister, and Kevin is the founder and president of Defend H2O. He's uniquely qualified in environmental protection. His academic training bridges disciplines within the biological and physical sciences. Educational achievements include undergraduate degrees in natural resources conservation and marine biology, with a Master's of Science in Coastal Zone Management. Kevin's professional experience in coastal zone management spans 30 years of working in government, as a consultant, and for nonprofit entities. He has been the recipient of numerous awards for his professional accomplishments, including the prestigious Environmental Quality Award presented by the U.S. Environmental Protection Agency, before Scott Pruitt, haha. No. Please welcome Kevin McAllister.
Thank you, Penny. Can everyone hear me just fine? Wonderful turnout. I'm honored. I'd like to thank the library, of course, for hosting us this evening, and again, great turnout. Largely, my program is pictures, and they will tell 1,000 words, as that adage goes. Penny alluded to my background in coastal zone management. I worked in South Florida for about 15 years. A lot of that time was with Palm Beach County in shoreline protection. So based on academics, professional experience, and lifestyle, I certainly know shorelines and beaches. And I've been trying to really, I think, sound the alarm with respect to climate change and sea level rise. I think we've been apathetic in our response in our management of shorelines, and I'll certainly describe to you in detail my concerns. This is North Topsail in North Carolina. I refer to this photograph as Swallowed Whole. You can see obviously the structure that's been constructed, the geotextile material, large sandbags that have been placed to try to stem the surge of the ocean. But the backside, if you look at the top right, is expansive tidal wetlands that are slowly basically moving seaward as sea level comes up. This particular location, in my professional opinion, is untenable. So, rather than prolong the problems, I think a decision has to be made in this location. I'm a student of Dr. Orrin Pilkey from afar. I've read a number of his books. He is professor emeritus from Duke University. He really put forward this In the Beaches of Moving, a great book. He has several publications. I subscribe to his philosophy with respect to beaches, the need to allow them to breathe, if you will. With the dynamic equilibrium, and certainly from my experience, I see this day in and day out. These four factors will influence shorelines: wave energy, shape of the beach, sand supply, and sea level rise. And if you look at the arrows, ultimately there's adjustment based on the direction of the arrow. Sea level rise, of course, is its own beast, if you will. But there are adjustments on the shoreline with respect to disturbances or interferences with these factors. Wave energy or ocean energy. This is Winter Storm Grayson. You might recall that was January 4th of 18. Unbelievable. I refer to it as a winter hurricane. Came up the coast, just continued to build. I think off of Nantucket they reached 80-mile-per-hour winds. Ultimately, the energy will drive waves. So there's several factors with wave energy, and that's the velocity of winds. The duration the wind blows. Is it 12 hours, 24 hours, or is it 4 days where even a small depression can sit off the coast just grinding at a beach? And then the last factor is the fetch. In other words, the distance across the water. When these big lows actually sit off of the ocean, and we've all been down at the beach on a beautiful sunny day, calm weather, and just tremendous ground swells coming in, the low pressure systems will allow the ocean, if you can picture, it's not a horizontal plane. There are really peaks, I guess, or mounds to the ocean where it starts to pump a groundswell. But that is the driving force behind, ultimately, the changes. Shape of the beach. This was taken, this is in Bridgehampton. This was a photograph, the first really energy of the season. So I think it was a late August, what's called a winter-summer profile. So in the summertime, you have basically the sands are welding onto the beach. You don't have the energy, dried sand, some wind blown, and you ultimately, what's called the berm, is the dry portion of the beach will build up and build out. I noticed in particular, and had gotten a lot of questions in, I think it was probably April or May, and we had a pretty long winter season or energy season. The sandbars started just rolling in, and you could see what's called runnels, depressional areas longitudinally to the bay, to the beach, excuse me. And what was happening, that sand was just migrating near shore, ultimately up on the beach. And this is the first storm where now the material has been moved off, the profile changes, so from a perched beach berm to ultimately a lower profile where the material is dragged back offshore. Source of sand, another important factor. This is in Amagansett, see that the main works. When I talk about beaches, they're relying on dunes as well. So it's a system, the beach dune system. So ultimately with the sand supply, think of sand reservoirs, dunes. They're meant to give up the material under wave attack and energy. That material will basically winnow out seaward, with calmer conditions, and over time that wind-blown sand, either creeping across the surface or sometimes actually aerial deposition. Because this particular stretch of, double dunes in East Hampton and through Amagansett, much of the development was set back. So this is really a natural system that's allowed to fluctuate, and quite frankly, there's very little erosion because there's always recovery. So we have to look at a coastal system in the context of a beach dune system. Bluffs, another important source of sediments, particularly when we get into the East End. Obviously, some of the islands, Gardeners, Robbins Island, much of East Hampton has blufflands. But I guess I'll draw your attention that this is certainly a viable beach system, where there's, of course, an enormous amount of material that's in that bluff system under wave attack that will slump and replenish and winnow out onto the open beach, maintaining that equilibrium. Again, just always think in terms of that dynamic equilibrium. Wave energy, ocean energy, sand supply. There's a great photo. This is Dr. Flagg from Stony Brook University took this. He's been monitoring Old Inlet in Great South Bay, the old Belport Inlet. This was punched through with Hurricane Sandy. So that was the end of October 4 years ago, maybe 5 now. I thought that the features are quite incredible. With this fan feature, ultimately, as I described the onshore-offshore cycle, material, what's called littoral drift, is moving up and down the coast. And again, depending on the direction of the energy, ocean energy, the waves, the prevailing or net flow is from east to west on Long Island. If you've ever seen photographs of Fire Island Inlet and the lighthouse there, and I'm not sure when that was built, but ultimately, at the point of construction, it was toward the end of Fire Island, and now there's probably 1.5 miles or more of beach through Robert Moses in there. But with the old inlet, the initial response, the Army Corps and some elected officials wanted to immediately close this breach. And many of us were calling for, timeout, let's pause here. The benefits to water quality, of course, with the exchange coming in and out of the inlet. If you know this section of Great South Bay, to the east is Narrows, so it is Back Bay. It does receive a great deal of influence from the mainland. Historically, or I should say, did not have the turnover, the flushing effect, and this is enormous benefit in as far as having that flushing effect. This is an older photo. It's, I'm sorry I didn't put the date on there. It's at least several years old now. It's really changed a lot, but ultimately it has maintained an open condition. The concern was that it was going to cause enormous flooding to the mainland, and through largely Dr. Flagg's work, it's shown that it's discernible on the actual flooding impact on the mainland, and we are in fact receiving the benefits to water quality. Now we get into interruptions, and this is really at core of much of my discussion this evening. When we start really engineering solutions or influences that affect the coast. Of course, this is the Shinnecock Inlet, Southampton to the east. This is called the Bowl. But what I want to point out is the typical offset by these inlets. With the net flow of sand coming toward you, east to west, the jetty itself, and for, I guess, clarity on the terms, jetties are shore perpendicular structures that are aligned with inlets. Groins are the same without the inlet being present. But the same engineering approach is ultimately to trap sand as it moves down. In this case, I mean, the real purpose, of course, is maintaining a navigable inlet, since we have a fishing fleet that's operable. In the case of the inlets, and we saw this on the preceding slide, you have what's called a flood delta that forms. So think of the energy in the flood tide coming in as sediments are in suspension in the water column. Water's coming into the inlet at great velocity. Ultimately, as it enters the bay, at some point it loses that head of steam and the material deposits out. So you end up with giant sandbars. And the same is true on the offshore, the Ebb Shoal. So you have material that would be jetted offshore that ends up depositing out, off the screen here. But because of now the fact that there's an interruption, you're disrupting littoral drift. Again, the influences of the structure, you end up with a scoured beach to the downdrift side. There's a great photo. This is Montauk, Lake Montauk. So Block Island Sound. This is the east side called Gin Beach. In this case, again, the net flow is east to west. So we have enormous buildup. You can see, this is all dune through here. Enormous buildup. Material on an outgoing tide. If there's material in here that's skipping around, it could be jetted off, or much of the material, some of the material is brought in. At some point, again, it loses the head of steam, turbulence. So you have to have that energy to carry sand. It will be deposited here. And now we have a sand deficit of sand stark beach. And if you've been following the press, about 2 weeks ago, actually, the court ruled that homeowners through this section, there it is. Now we're looking across to the west side of the jetty. You can see the structures, rock revetments, bulkheads. The homeowners organized. They filed a lawsuit against the Army Corps of Engineers. They maintain the navigation of that inlet, as well as the town of East Hampton that actually owns the jetties. They prevailed in that lawsuit. There was culpability, accountability assigned. They let the Army Corps off the hook. The court did, the judge did, ultimately, but did assign accountability to the town of East Hampton. So now they have to, I think, work out some form of agreement where there will be sand placed, maybe a one-time event, or something that I've been certainly, let me go back if I can, advocating for, and I see this at all the inlets. Ultimately, and they employ this in South Florida, and this is from my experience down there, is sand bypassing or inlet bypassing. The material that builds up here via a pipe and hydraulic dredge would be pumped and discharged across here. In some cases, in the throat of the inlet, they might dig a deep sand trap. So in other words, it's say a rectangular pit. And that material that is moving in the inlet would settle out, and then with regularity, they are dredging and pumping. So the idea is over the course of the year, what would be considered the net flow, the sand budget, they try to maintain to the extent they can, that material moving through. So inlets, of course, navigable inlets, they're necessary. It's not as though we can walk away from this. But we do have to be thoughtful about management techniques and policies that ensure that, again, sand is flowing. And to date, that hasn't happened. We get into the short perpendicular structures. Of course, this is the bulkhead. This area is North Sea Beach. And these bulkheads were installed decades ago. Many of them, they are in front of bluffs. There are homes behind them. Ultimately, it is individual property owners that are installing these to protect property largely. But again, individual properties, if they all follow suit, you end up with lengthy reaches of shoreline that has been armored. Now under wave attack, and again, think of the natural dune, the beach dune system. Energy, and this was a high energy day, higher tide and turbulence reflecting off the walls, bouncing back. You end up basically driving material offshore. The ability, because of the fact that there's so much turbulence, what I describe as the walls are in play, you don't really get the sand deposition. In the summertime, you may have some, but ultimately, it's a losing prospect over the long term. And what I'm seeing is more and more structures going in throughout the coastal zone on all of our coasts, the Atlantic beaches, Greater Peconic Estuary, and Long Island Sound. This is Long Island Sound. This location is Nisqually, up around Smithtown. This particular structure was, and I don't have the photo that Storm Grayson that I showed you actually took out all of the facing boards in part. But this is too much energy. The bluff has a recede behind it. This is a real problem. So now we lose that intertidal zone. Again, that zone between high water and low water. So let's think of a Florida beach. That might be nesting habitat for marine turtles. I know that from experience, and that largely my work around some of the beach nourishment projects was focused on that. We get up into the northern or local area, we're talking important shorebirds, horseshoe crab nesting, which are in decline, and largely we assign the decline to overfishing. They are used for bait, but we are losing vast reaches of habitat. And this comes in very incrementally. So think in terms of a couple hundred feet at a time over the course of 10, 20 years time. You can really transform a shoreline permanently by virtue of 200 feet at a time. And in the case of these bulkheads, what's called end scour, and oftentimes you see returns. So in other words, the wall is facing the sea, and at the end of the property, they'll do a 90-degree turn to try to stem that end scour, but inevitably the ends do scour out. In other words, more accelerated erosion, and then you force your neighbors to follow suit. So incrementally, there's the other 200 feet of wall. I've been very active in this area because of the fact, and this is a long-term prospect. I'll say this is roughly 1.5 miles long reach of shoreline. It is bluffs. Again, so we're starving or cutting off that sand supply, right? So there's no beach dune or beach bluff system. The sand supply is cut off. We are accelerating fronting erosion at both ends between that roughly 1.5 mile stretch, thereabouts mile. We have 2 large public beaches. So again, when you consider the system as a whole and the availability of sediments moving up and down the coastline, lack of sand supply, long term, we can have major implications to those public beaches or recreational use. And I will tell you, and you can, do you mind turning out the lights?
Sure, absolutely.
Thank you. You look right here, there's a bit of a tide line. I think roughly the tidal range in this area is maybe 4 feet thereabouts. You'll see it when we turn on to. And the point I want to make, that's better, thank you so much. Did everybody kind of pick that up a little bit? All right. So that means high tide is consistently at the feet of the wall. Low tide, we have minimal beach. The ability to walk that shoreline is lost. So now we're talking not only the ecological implications, but public use. This is closer to home. This is Southampton, the Ocean Beach. The coffer or sheep piles seawall is on I don't show the east side, but it basically it's a promenade out there. It's on 3 sides, and then walls do run to the east. So this is a winter photo. You can see the erosion of the dune, the ability to walk that beach where you have public access. And historically, hey, let's, my friend and I take a nice 2-mile long walk. now all of a sudden it's impossible to walk down through that beach. And that, of course, was installed to protect, the private property in the home. And, I can recognize the interest, but I think we've always got to be mindful of the, the larger implications, and particularly to public use. This is in Montauk. Now we're getting into stone revetments. Expansive stone, if you know this section, this I refer to as trailer park. It's a circumspotted ditch planings beach. Montauk condominiums, Montauk Shores is what it's called, but on the backside, historically, it was 1960s trailers, mobile homes that slowly have transformed into more permanent homes. And I'll say that the physical structures themselves are closer to larger and more expansive homes. And the trailer days are kind of over. But the fact is, because of the implications and the effects of this revetment, access along this stretch is largely cut off, particularly even at a low tide on gentle seas. There's really not much space to walk, and that's all going to change. This is, I'll call it a hybrid between a revetment. The stones, almost like headstones, they were chinked in vertically with some gaps between it. And I know the intent was not to have the same effect as a stone revetment, but ultimately, this is a large stretch in Peconic Bay, a 1.5 mile long structure, largely all bluffs. So again, we're cutting off that sand supply that would otherwise replenish the fronting beach. High energy, you can see the conditions when I took this photograph. And what you really don't see, here's the bluff line, of course, coming down, and there's a terracing effect. So although perhaps the intent by the engineer was designed where it would not have that impact on the shoreline, it does in fact have that impact on the shoreline. So, while the bluff might slump in some sediments from even seaward moving or shoreward moving sediments might accrete in here, it's building up a bit like a terrace. So in other words, this is roughly 6 inches or so higher than what's in front. But nevertheless, it's a structure. A structure is a structure. And it does have an adverse impact on the fronting beach. And I will tell you from public access, public access is very near to this site. And historically, this was access for beach vehicles, for fishing, as well as beach walkers. That, if it's not lost today, it will be lost with permanence short order. This is in Shinnecock Bay, a gabion, and I will tell you this now has probably been installed, I will say roughly maybe 10 years or less, 7 to 10 years. Kiana Bay Park, you can see this is a town parcel, town park land. They have a marina for visitors to the beach, and then on the ocean side, of course, the public beach. But when this gabion was installed, it was buried under the sediments. It was set back, so the shoreline was out here, mean high water line. Ultimately, this was trenched and constructed. You can see the wire configuration that's holding, say cobble size stone. It's lower profile, but nevertheless still responds as a shore parallel hardened structure. And hardening the shoreline, again, has the ramifications to it. You lose, sediment supply is cut off. You can see here basically the high tide line now. And I will tell you, this is a very highly used horseshoe crab nesting area through this whole stretch. So, roughly on 400 feet, thereabouts, on this gabion for the length of the park. It's dangerous, quite frankly, whether to walk or never mind being, a spider, a horseshoe crab walking up the beach. It's no longer accessible. And that'll become more prominent as again, the shoreline changes and sea level rise continues. This is a photo in Gardener's Day. This has it all going on. So you can see the stone groins, right? A timber groin, a concrete bulkhead, timber bulkhead, and all these groins up and down. And there's another one. I will tell you, if when I look at aerial photos often, I mean, that's the bird's eye view, and the accessibility now with Google Earth, as well as Suffolk County, they have some really great aerials dating back to the 60s beyond, and you can really see the changes when you look through the, every 10 years or so of photographs of the same location. But to the north from here, and I don't know how this got in, but ultimately there was a large groin that was installed, almost like a platform. So it was, I don't know how it was described in the application process, but it did get built decades ago or years ago. And if you look at the photograph, it is locking up all that sand that would be moving from the north to the south. The beach is extremely wide. There's a massive dune field in front of the bluff, which is generally unusual, but because of the fact that we were robbed Peter and paid Paul, they locked up that sediment. That scouring effect causes that downdrift side to really be carved back. So it's, again, for every action there's a reaction. And I guess from a coastal management perspective, the notion that we are looking at, excuse me, 200 feet, 400 feet of shoreline and making decisions on that, that's misguided. Back to the Nissequogue, my efforts within that community and before the trustees, I'm trying to advise them, don't allow the structures to come in, because ultimately you are killing your own beaches, and then over the long term will have an effect on two very prominent public beaches. And I will tell you in the instance of, and this will really be a bit of a closing, but when there's room to move, we've got to consider that as opposed to these individual structures. Montauk, and this is certainly featured prominently in the press. My organization, I have been very involved in the downtown Montauk project. If you know Montauk, when you come down the hill, you're basically at sea level. You have Fort Pond to your north, the Atlantic Ocean, of course. There is roughly, say, 6 or 7 motels, hotels that really transformed into condominiums along the ocean front. When these were constructed in the 60s, they actually went into the primary dune and flat-topped it in order to really get the buildings and the rooms out front, with a big wide beach at the time. But things have changed. This photo was taken by VM. Of course, you can see the energy. That was October of 2015. It was right before the town, DEC, Army Corps of Engineers, and Suffolk County all participated as basically co-sponsors for a project of sandbag revetments over the half mile. Myself and Surfrider Association Foundation, we had opposed this, arguing that it would destroy the fronting beach. What I really, I'll say, take exception to, when this was being promoted and built for permitting and construction, the Army Corps would describe it as a reinforced dune, and this is principally their design. It absolutely is not a dune. Let me show you the next photo. This is after it was installed. The last photo will be the giveaway. So this is late April of 2016. They started construction roughly November, finished in April, over, again, a half-mile long stretch. Underneath the beach grass are these, the sandbags. roughly 1.5 tons each, 14,000 bags stacked in a revetment style. So in other words, tiered up. They go back to, they put sand over the top. This is quarry sand, so it's not beach sediments. And the reason I tell you that, the coloration was different, the consistency of the material, but then there are absence of micronutrients that you would otherwise see in marine sediments and air-blown salt, where beach grass, thrives on it. The beach grass in this instance, hasn't been affected. The material, the beach grass up higher, and you can probably see it here. And this is April of this year. So this is the second iteration of the repair job. This was $1 million. The initial project was $10 million. The repair job, the second one was roughly $1.2 million. The one that preceded about the same time, the year prior, $1 million. But I draw your attention to the American beach grass. At some point they drive roots down. Again, the absence of those micronutrients in the sediments, the fact that they're going to penetrate plastic, synthetics. You don't get the root mass. The plants look anemic. So, that in part is why I take exception to be calling it a dune, and they continue to resonate that. And I feel in part it was a bit strategic on their part for public consumption. How can you object to a reinforced dune? Oh, that's great, they're building the dune. Well, no, it's a structure is a structure. Remedies. So I've described the bad and maybe the ugly. Here's the so-called good. Again, I draw on my experience in South Florida. They've been in the beach nourishment game since the 70s, starting in Miami, Broward County, Palm Beach, all up the coast now. I will tell you they are running out of sand, beach-compatible sediments. Miami now is trucking in material from quarries, and having lived there for 15 years, I'm not quite sure where those quarries are out, near the Everglades, but presumably they're getting that old ancient ridge that is, a bit of the spine of Florida that most of us don't see because you don't really travel there. But they are running out of sand, and now they're talking about trying to go to the Bahamas to get the material. It's a real problem. This particular project is local. This was the Sagaponic Beach Nourishment Project, which is, I guess, roughly 5 or 6 years now. It actually performed quite well. The average lifespan in the Mid-Atlantic region is 3, 4, 5 years time. Again, because of the generally incompatibility of the sediments. The dredges, you can't see it out of the site here, but offshore dredge, pumping, digging large holes, pumping that material onshore. Again, I can tell you from, I frequent the beaches there a lot, so I can tell you it's very consistent material. They lucked out. They had a good source offshore. That's not always the case. I've worked on projects in South Florida, Jupiter, for instance, in the mid-'80s, where ultimately the engineers, based on their analysis, taking core samples, said, "Oh, we've got perfect beach sand. It's matching up to the grain size exactly." When they drive cores down, they'll analyze through sieve analysis the sediments, and what was in fact, I'll say the average grain size or mean grain size was a form of limestone cobble and silt. And then if you average the two, you ended up in that range of beach sand. The beach they built that I was involved with the marine turtles and trying to build dunes in that area, because it was fine sediments packed down like concrete, and under wave attack, instead of, you saw that one photo, the early photo with the sloping winter profile, it created a giant, a very vertical scarp. So the impacts the marine turtles trying to nest, and the project was completed I'll say the end of February, right on the cusp of turtle season, nesting season, it unraveled very quickly under wave attack. You had that vertical scarp, I recall it 6-8 feet tall. They had to bring in machinery with giant rakes just to loosen the material because it did pack down like concrete, and to ultimately eliminate that vertical scarp into a sloping configuration. Finer material under wave attack, went into suspension very quickly and disappeared. I think they got a year and a half out of that beach. I believe at the time it was a mile and a half, $15 million project. Sagaponic, I'm sorry, I apologize for the photo, this is off the internet. You can see the machinery though, they'll pump deep water, and then ultimately as the material, I won't say dries out, but, is workable, then the machines will continue to push and grade. And they just keep adding lanes of pipe as they go down the beach. Sagaponic, roughly, I think 2+ miles. It was 2+ miles, $27 million. A good rule of thumb is 10 to 15 million per mile. Again, in the case of Sagaponic, it performed well. It is probably 5, 6, 7 years, about 6 years now. I believe the winter activity that we had did start to erode the western section, so they need to start thinking about renourishment potentially in the near future. But as far as beach nourishment goes, they got their money's worth, from that application. Something we don't talk about, and I guess I have this discussion with folks all the time that can't comprehend how is beach nourishment bad, other than the cost. Well, it is very expensive, as I described. Depending on the sediment type, you could lose that beach in the winter season, literally. There's I'll say not case studies, but many examples up and down the East Coast that have had that situation. Folly Beach, I think, in South Carolina. But what we're not thinking about when you consider, and here's another scale for you, the Quag Beach Nourishment Project, which was permitted, has not been built roughly 2 years ago. 1.1 million cubic yards over the course of mile plus. The dredge hole was 100 acres in size to -7 feet deep. So you're talking, a major pit out there. When you consider the sediments and just material moving up and down the coast, again, a lot of energy. This is, maybe a mile offshore, just, beyond closure depth into beyond the sandbars, 30 feet of water. That size hole over time, will accumulate organics and they will build up. So you end up, aside from the physical footprint, that does disrupt and knock out, populations of benthic organisms, the recovery oftentimes becomes very organic. So, my experience in monitoring dredging, you never see the full recovery. The biology in these dredge cuts is never the same, because of that buildup of organics. And in a higher energy ocean condition, I won't describe it as mayonnaise, but when you get into the bays and you're digging holes, and we have to do it, of course, for navigation, but there is a downside where the buildup of organics decomposing become large dead zones. So there are biological impacts associated with this, and they largely go unaccounted for. I'll tell you in the Quag application, very little other than myself and a few other fishermen talking about the nearshore implications. There are migratory fish species that are relying on 30 feet of water. When you get into 100-acre holes, back to the lifespan of these projects, 3, 4, 5 years. Where's the next hole of 100 acres? How often? And again, if you have a beach that disappears very quickly. You know, even if you have the funding mechanism in place, you dig that next hole, where's the third, where's the fifth? And, you know, again, over the time of recovery, you can really alter the, you know, the fisheries substantially. In the case of Montauk, you know, what was initially this, and I will tell you, the Army Corps, their intent was that geotextile sandbag wall, and they were done. But because of the, I'll say, the government pushback, town of East Hampton in particular, and then the public at large, when they become educated, voicing their concern, the Army Corps, as part of their Fire Island to Montauk Point plan, which is a several $billion-dollar, I'll call it beach alteration project from Fire Island Inlet to Montauk Point, has committed to beach nourishment. So, you know, I mean, this has been languishing since the 60s, up until, you know, approximately 3 years ago. You know, they got congressional funding for this. So, you know, it's now about really putting, you know, starting to build things. You know, the Army Corps has acknowledged, and this goes to, I'd say largely my questioning of the Corps in these meetings that they held, I'll call it the roadshow. About a year ago, they held 4 meetings from Babylon to Montauk. I attended all of them to ask them pointed questions. They acknowledged that in 30 years' time, this is the life of the project, they are getting out of the sand business. And put it in perspective, every community up and down the East Coast, California, they all have the same problems. They're all clamoring for sand. How are we going to pay for it? And again, to my experience, and this holds true today, from Florida, there's only several large dredging companies with, you know, these are major, you know, massive, call them ships, you know, that are capable of dredging the seafloor, you know, 1 million, 2 million cubic yards, 3 million at a time. You know, they're in high demand. And that Jupiter project I described to you, you know, they were really supposed to line up, I think, at least a month earlier, and they were called to Delaware on a, you know, an emergency response. So, you know, that demand for these dredges is only going to increase. And, you know, when we're watching beaches unravel, you know, something's got to give. The projections. New York State in February of 2017, after probably 6 years, and I followed this closely, you know, they finally put into their regulations sea level rise projections. And what I captured here is the Long Island region. If you look at the dates here, of course, time interval. The low projection is the current sea level rise, so we can discount that. What we're dealing with is medium to high. I'll draw your attention to this line, the 50s. So from present to the 50s, roughly 40 years. What we have seen over the past 40 years is approximately a 4-inch rise. So an inch a decade. We're looking in the Long Island region of 11 inches to 30 inches. So a real ramp up of basically sea level rise. So those low-lying areas, for that matter, even if they're not, you know, there's going to be, we're going to be dealing with massive beach erosion over time, and there's got to be a thoughtful management response. Dune Road, this was actually on the invitation, I think, or a photo that was similar to this. This is Quag, East Quag section. During the storm event, I will tell you just from a historic perspective, me checking surf since, you know, teenager, up and down this road, the presence of flooding, I mean, it always flooded, but it was periodic. And now we're getting into a situation where, you know, any nor'easter, any big storm event, reasonable storm event, will cause flooding. I don't know what storm this was. I don't know if this was Grayson or one of the others. It might actually predates this year. But you can see the fact that the bay waters move south. If you know that stretch of shoreline, you can actually see tidal wetlands that have really formed and expanding on the south side of Dune Road, immediately behind the dunes. And like an amoeba, they're going to find elevation and ultimately expand. You know, there's a change in again, the shoreline, change that we have to manage. Southampton, in one section of road, just this last winter, they spent $1 million. You might have seen this in the press. They claimed they were going to raise the road 6 inches to provide some relief. I will tell you, just from bicycling it and knowing the road pretty well, it was more on the order of 3 or 4 inches in most places. You know, it was a Band-Aid, quite frankly, and that was $1 million Band-Aid. I've urged Southampton officials, particularly to be thoughtful about their investments in their own beaches. Here's a good example, the old life-saving station. They're talking about $1 million investment to refurbish the Tiana Beach life-saving station. Of course, historic, you know, interest to all of us. But, you know, do we want to make that investment in the structure that in a location that's very tenuous? Sunny day flooding for my friends in Miami. And I copped that term from Miami, but I will tell you once again, Dune Road, I know firsthand this photo, I took it. It was an October photo, and it was roughly 3 weeks or 2 weeks, and you know the climate, of course, or weather in September, October. I mean, it's pristine generally. But we had 2 weeks plus, at least, yeah, approximately 2 weeks. I don't want to embellish it, of dry weather. And this was either a full moon or new moon. I think it was a full moon, where what's called coastal inundation, where you actually have water coming up from below. So the fresh water and seawater coming in. Saltwater intrusion is going to be a major problem where that wedge drives, interfacing with fresh water, causing the water table to rise. Our septic systems are in it, potentially exposing affecting water quality with pathogens. So there's things below the ground that are actually of concern. But sunny day flooding, again, no rain events, but this is pretty typical now of Dune Road. Throughout certain stretches, depending on elevation, and you can see wetland on both sides. Again, I'm urging town officials to really start to grapple with low-lying areas and what's the plan. And unfortunately, and here's editorial on my part, because our elected officials are largely thinking in 2-year and 4-year cycles, terms, making decisions today that would benefit us or be thoughtful 20, 30, 40 years out is difficult for them when it comes to expenditures, or for that matter making hard choices. And I found this article, I'm trying to think where it was, in New Yorker. I shared with a number of people in California, and the thesis of the article is we have to make a choice. Are we protecting homes or the public beaches? And in this instance, I feel we've got to make the choice here. How much do we throw the money at this? What are we going to raise and create a causeway that's surrounded by wetlands to get to the Tiana Bay life-saving station that really should be relocated? And I'll leave you with the last slide, and we got maybe a couple minutes for questions. But once again, North Carolina coastal retreat. And I advocate for that where it's practical and feasible. I will tell you locations throughout the towns, throughout the East End where I think it's appropriate. Right now in Hashomamak on the North Shore, North Fork, if you're heading to the ferry, if you know Southold at all, the Hashomamak Pond comes in from Peconic Bay. It virtually almost meets Long Island Sound. There's an isthmus through there. It's been armored. The Army Corps now is looking to come in $15 million for 1.5 miles plus to bring in a ribbon of sand. And let's start talking about basically withdrawing from certain locations. Dune Road, Hashomamak. Trying to think of the road out in East Hampton, but these are low-lying areas. And again, this isn't dismissive of people's homes. But I have to say, when there are properties that have the potential to move back, and we are talking, you know, in some cases, vacation homes, which the seawall in Southampton is, you know, do we sacrifice public beaches and public access in the interest of fortifying the coast? And I don't know if you've been following, but the Newsday in particular has been very strong in their editorials, you know, really calling into question sea level rise and the fortification of the coast, the seawalls. Again, we got to be mindful of this. So through my efforts, I certainly engage public officials, elected officials, to be, you know, thoughtful of their decisions, but to, you know, in particular, engage the public to participate in this public conversation, to ensure that our elected officials have the support to make that 25-year decision rather than the 2-year decision that ensures, you know, they're elected in the next November 3rd. So we're very close to time, but maybe a couple of questions.
No, we got time for questions. Yeah,
Okay,
so
great.
let's, yeah.
Yes, ma'am.
Has anyone learned anything from Dubai? They were doing a lot of dredging. They made the palm tree island world, all of that. They were like on steroids when they were
Yes.
doing all of that.
I will
Has
tell you
anyone
from
learned
what
anything
I've
about
read, sand supply is diminishing, you know, because, I mean, there are, you know, I've read stories where trucks have come in the dead of night and actually removed beaches for sand supplies. This is, of course, other parts of the world, but sand is going to be in high demand. We've already seen it in South Florida where, you know, they're talking about going to the Bahamas to try to, you know, barge it over, you know, to you know, get a ribbon in front of the Doral Hotel, you know, for you know, blanket season. Yes, sir.
What do you think should be done in Montauk where they have those sandbags? I walk it once a week out there and I walk that beach, you know, throughout the year.
Providing they do proper investigation for sand source, and it's uncertain of the sand source, you know, they don't want to go offshore and be pumping cobble onto that beach. It's a recreational beach. If a project buys them some time or two, but I've been advocating, and I'll say, quite frankly, I'll take at least some credit for raising the conversation. The town of East Hampton is, in fact, engaging the front row to start talking about relocation. So transfer of development rights, finding places where hotels can be rebuilt, maybe, you know, even through tax support, but ultimately to vacate that front row, restore a large primary dune in there, a real dune with restoration, where you at least start to fortify that downtown. And maybe that's not enough over the long term, but where possible and feasible, let's start talking about coastal retreat, because you know, how often, you know, or when are we going to get tired of $20 million price tags? And the Corps' getting out of the business. And what is happening is a movement to these erosion control districts, where, you know, they'll establish zones and have tax base to pay for sand in certain locations. And these are starting to come in. North Sea just approved one. Montauk's talking about it. I know the North Fork is talking about it. You know, I'm trying to think where else they exist, but you know, I'm asking that we be very cautious and full disclosure on the longevity of these projects, because you know, in the case of Quogue, and to their credit, to the community's credit, I being one of them, you know, there was enormous pushback to the beach nourishment, because ultimately when they pulled the permit for the project, then it was, okay, who's, you know, how far are we, where's our zone going in the community? And, you know, I'm not on the ocean, I'm a half a mile or so back. I don't want to pay for that beach out there when I think, again, a more difficult choice is appropriate. Yes, sir.
If you relocated and you essentially step back from the beach, or if the beach is pristine and natural to begin with, do the sand and the dunes rise with the rising ocean?
If the beach is natural, with that one photo with the bluff, that's Cedar Point County Park, big bluff, big beach. The system's intact. Amagansett through there, Double Dunes, the system's intact. You know, the shoreline may retreat, but you will always have a beach. The beach will always be there. It's when we influence the sand with structures, largely with the structures. Yes, sir, you had a question. I'm sorry.
Have they thought about here in Long Island, like they've done in Miami Beach, with pumps and raising roads and so on, especially as you showed
Dune Road in
Dune
particular?
Road and so on?
They've got to start talking about it. And you know, let me be clear. I'm pragmatic. I mean, I realize where we built and you know we're in. I mean, there's some locations that we just can't vacate, but we have to be sensible about it, and we have to be forthcoming about what it will cost to stay in a location or to maintain a beach in a particular location. And let's be talking about this back to the sea level rise projections. Let's have at least some a benchmark, I guess a benchmark for our discussions. And you know, let's be thinking 30, 40 years, you know, longer for that matter. Because, you know, again, I'm in this is my profession. I'm in front of these boards all the time, and I can tell you, you know, their decisions are in such short time frames. They're been largely frozen, I believe, in making these long-term decisions. You know, because, you know, it's like, why take that on if they can avoid it? And, you know, here's a critique on in the case of the New York State Department of Environmental Conservation. They have well-founded coastal policies and regulations that are intent, 1984, to protect these natural features of beaches and dunes and bluffs. And they're giving away the permits. You know, they're acquiescing to the pressure, you know, from the homeowner with the consultant and the lawyer that comes in. Hey, you know, I can't lose real estate, and that's the argument. And again, I don't want to be overly cavalier about this, but I think, you know, we've got to have eyes wide open and make the correct choices. And in my opinion, beaches and natural systems come first versus, you know, protecting some private property interests at the loss of public interest. Yes, ma'am.
Has there been any consideration of using CPF monies to compensate homeowners who are willing sellers?
Yes, and I think that's great news. I'm not sure of Southampton's application. I will tell you, East Hampton has done this, where there's actual dwellings beyond the property, on the property. They're buying the home with the land, waterfront, and they're taking the homes down and converting them to natural buffers. And that's really what we've got to be thinking. So to the extent that we can support Southampton Town in their endeavor to identify these parcels and acquire them, again, we've got to start really you know, compensating and pulling back. And you know, one last point on, you know, the FEMA or the, you know, the insurance. You know, I personally have an issue where federal tax dollars, our taxes, are paying for reconstruction over and over again. You know, and I use the adage, one and done. You know, and make someone whole for the loss of their home and their property, but we can't just keep putting it back. You know, it's stupidity. And you know, I know the feds are feeling the pain. It's you know, the Army Corps is getting out of the sand business in 30 years. You know, they have acknowledged that. So, you know, why keep compensating? And unfortunately, you know, we're still pushing the envelope with respect to development in these highly vulnerable coastal areas. Anyone else? Well, I'm again honored that. Oh.
I would thank
Oh,
that,
I'm sorry.
but also bring up, if you're concerned about climate change, there's a group called Citizens Climate Lobby, which works on that, which has a potential solution, and whose green brochures are the good thing. So pick up one, my name's on it, took home.
Very good, thank you. Thank you for that.
Thank you so much. Don't go anywhere. Don't leave. I wanted to mention that some of you came in a little bit later than others, and those of you who are interested in being on Kevin's mailing list, just to get communications about issues like this, are invited to sign up on the sheet over on the table. Kevin, thank you for your wonderful work.